All right, we are moving on with our next segment. We'll be looking at the mobility of audiences and the sustainability of our office. And there are some tourism magnets. How can we act to reduce greenhouse gases emissions when it comes to audience mobility? We will be discussing that with Heather Carter, who is doing us the honor of being with us from the UK. She's the Director of Operations for BLENHEIM Palace, one of the main castles in the UK, near Oxford. We also have Philippe Platel, the Director of Normandie Impressionniste, a festival that which next edition will be held in 2024. We also have Margot, LADIRAY, a journalist for TOM.TRAVEL, and a surprise, Caroline Mignon, who was supposed to be there for the previous segment, but she accepted to stay with us because she knows everything about sustainable tourism, since she is the president of ACTEURS du tourisme durable. Margot LADIRAY, a journalist at TOM.TRAVEL, will be moderating this roundtable. Thank you, and we'll be talking about sustainable mobility. My name is Margot. I am a journalist for Tom. So, green mobility. This is one of the main topics of the year. Everyone talks about it, but what is it even? It covers a lot of different solutions for slower and less polluting mobility, greener mobility. The objective of those new options is, of course, to save the planet, but not just, because it also aims at making monuments and touristic sites more accessible. Because we have a challenge today, which is that our visitors emit a lot of greenhouse gases, and therefore they pollute a lot. Of course, it is an environmental issue. And when I say environment, it means the planet, but not just. It's also the local environment, the quality of the environment in the building itself or in the local site. So it is very important to understand why sustainable mobility is such a big topic for cultural institutions. What kind of solutions can we implement? And what are the limits of what they can do? And I will start by turning to Philippe. What are the main challenges, Philippe, that you have today when it comes to mobility, and green mobility in particular? Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Our festival, Normandie Impressionniste, I should say a few words about that, because I think it really articulates with the topics that you mentioned. It's a multidisciplinary artistic festival with a lot of big exhibitions, and we are a multi-site. We are present in the whole of the Normandy region. We're there, of course, along the Seine River, which is the typical path for the Impressionist painters, with Le Rouen and Le Havre. But we're also present in more remote areas and sites. And that is part of the problem. It's a long festival because it covers most of spring and most of summer. And we encourage the audience to come and stay and come back, and to see a number of different sites and events. So there are some cities that are very easy to access, like Rouen and Le Havre. They are well connected to the transportation network. You can go there by train to Le Havre. So that's easy enough. But for some more remote areas, it's a lot more difficult. And that's where the challenge is for us. This is a challenge that we are more and more aware of. In the past, we also encouraged our audience to create their own trajectories, their own pathways, and to create their own narratives covering different sites. So for previous editions, we suggested a number of such trajectories or pathways, but we did not really think about mobility. So we had this offer, but we did not really think how people would be going from Le Havre to Giverny for a couple of days. I'm not pointing the finger at past editions at all. That's not what I'm doing. What I'm saying is that now we do take this question into account, and we're looking for solutions. So again, this is our main challenge. How do we encourage the audience to experience this region-wide festival, taking into account the fact that it's a huge area? If you go from Cherbourg to the other side of Cotentin, it's a 3-hour drive, and it's a lot longer if you come from Paris. But of course, you can go by train from Paris to Le Havre. But then what do you do after that? And of course, there's also a broader issue, which is that when you go from one city to another, sometimes it's easier to go via Paris, even though those two cities might be close together. It's faster, cheaper, easier. So that really articulates with a national issue, which is the fact that everything goes through Paris. And sometimes the regional or local interconnection is a problem. And that's not just an issue for Normandy, but for every region in France. Absolutely. Emmanuel, you mentioned this last mile problem that we have. And you might think that in the Greater Paris area, the ILE-de-France region, it's not a real problem, or at least not as much as in a rural area, and that you have green offers everywhere. But you told me that the last mile issue was not actually solved in the Greater Paris area. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Indeed. Well, I think the first thing that you have to keep in mind is that the Greater Paris area is actually 50% rural. So if you're looking at Fontainebleau, Rambouillet, Vaux-le-Vicomte, Auvers-sur-Oise, those are cities or towns that are not so well connected. It's obviously not a problem if you're in Paris itself. There we have an excellent coverage, one of the best in the world. But the further you go from Paris, the more complicated it gets. And railroad transport, heavy transportation, they are there in bigger cities, but not in the smaller towns. So if your destination is Paris and the bigger area, you have to serve an audience that comes from everywhere. It's a global audience, and we're trying to make sure that people won't stay only in the in the square mile that is Paris itself, and that instead they will be going to Château, Saint-Germain, Auvers, etc. There's a lot of fascinating cultural offers in those smaller towns, but it's more difficult to have a green transportation offer there. I think we're actually lagging behind, for example, when it comes to bike paths or secure parking lots for bikes, bike rentals, all of that, the biking offer in general. We're lagging behind the needs. Heather, I would like to turn to you now. You were telling me about the problems that you have at Blenheim Palace. Where does it start if you want to have a green transition in a cultural institution, and yours in particular?
So at Blenheim Palace, we are in the heart of the Oxfordshire Cotswolds. We're 10 miles from our newest town. And we are actually quite in the centre of England. So there's lots of motorways that lead to us. So 90% of our visitors come by car. So how do we turn to sustainable transport? It was a really difficult challenge, and we've given it a lot of thought. There's not a lot of support out there. British government, Department for Transport, they concentrate mainly on the cities. Urban developments are very high on the spectrum, as we're talking about Paris, because you've got the bulk of the tourists are there. But the rural areas, the investment just trickles out to those places. So we're lucky, as in we're a big site. So we're a 300-year-old castle or palace. We're the birthplace of Winston Churchill. We are privately owned, and so the money that we make through the tourist attraction goes back into the tourist attraction to keep it standing. It's made out of sandstone. It suffers from the effects of global warming, so to us to be sustainable is really, really important. We want to educate our audiences and our communities into behaving in that way. So we have a lot of challenges with our local governments, and we are working really, really hard. We have very little investment into the energy networks. So in order to invest in EV chargers, that has to come from our funding. There's no other local funding for us. So we have a lot of challenge in turning our site into be sustainable. But I think we'll come on later to tell you about what we've done, and we've made some really exciting moves to try and change our ways.
Thank you so much. Heather, it's true that the question of financing and the budgets comes up again and again. We can understand, that's not your core business, and you have to devote part of your annual budget to trying to change transport system. Well, that's difficult because it's a budget that you would like to lose for something else, for the interpretive work, cultural mediation, and your own core activities. Caroline, perhaps you would like to say a few words. So, Caroline we've invited her to join this group. She comes from the Sustainable Tourism Professionals grouping. So tell us, is there something that cultural institutions can do to make up for this budget problem that they can devote to the environmental issues? Well, thank you so much for allowing me to join you. It's true that, well, who's responsible here for sustainable mobility? Is it for up to the cultural institutions so that their visitors can arrive by greener mobility modes, or something better than private cars in any case? Bicycles is one thing, but there's other motorized forms that could be greener. So for transportation, in France anyway, the regions are responsible for public transportation and all mobility, in fact, in their region. So the difficulty here, and things are not moving fast enough, in fact, for festivals or museums or hotels and recreational sites, we can all see there are no widespread solutions, no solution for mass green transport, in fact. So there's a lot of inaction there. So everyone says, well, it's not up to us, it's up to the local authorities. So it's pointing the finger at each other, really. But a region will say, well, its budget is for its local inhabitants. It's not for outsiders. And so everyone really wants to point the finger or shove the responsibility onto others. But at the same time, so that means we're simply not moving forward the way we need to. Okay, cycling is one thing. I'm an avid cyclist, but we cannot imagine that the bicycles are enough. And so we are not going to get everyone on bicycles anytime soon. Okay, it's true. It would be nice that there be more bicycles. A lot of trains in France. It's hard to get a bicycle on board, but that is not the fix-all solution. Okay, we saw some electric shuttles, even driverless shuttles, although those, well, have stalled a bit for technical reasons. But I think we need to have more regular coach services, bus services, and they need to continue into the evening, particularly in the summer. So that would be important as well. It's not just for people working, it's for people who want to go out as well. But so mobility has to be thought of not just for local residents, but if you look at a region like Paris, of course, there's more service, but at the same time, there's not enough organized for them elsewhere in the region, also outside of the heart of Paris. Well, Philippe, tell me, your festival, the Normandy Impressionist Valley, that takes place across the entire region, but you said it's a large region. Going from Étretat to Rouen by bicycle, I mean, that would be complicated to do, or you have to be particularly athletic and well-trained. So then what type of solutions are you looking to? You mentioned something to me the other day. How do you encourage travelers to shift their mode? And can it be included in the way you organize the festival? Okay, it's true that, well, we do have a lot of cycle paths in the region. It's true. And our tourist office promotes cycling tourism, but not everyone can do that, particularly when it's a culture about culturals. So yes, I totally agree that the bicycle doesn't resolve everything. It's a nice solution, but it's not going to be possible to cover all needs with the bicycle. So for a tourist, if you want to go to Normandy for a cultural visit, it's not always easy to identify what the different options are either. So we are already doing a mapping of what exists to better present the information. And just by doing this ourselves, we're discovering things. Okay, Rouen, Deauville. Okay, we thought, oh, well, that's not possible without a car. But in fact, it is, but it takes a certain amount of time. So then what do you do with that time? So if you tell people, well, you can do it, it'll take 2 hours instead of 1 hour in the car, well, people will just reject that straight away. But hey, why not? That's not a huge amount of time, in fact. And so for us, I think as tourism professionals, this creates an opportunity where we can continue our interaction with people, particularly for the festival. During that 2 hours, it's possible for us to communicate with the visitors, more so than if they're on their bicycles, and we can provide them with information, we can talk to them about an artist, we can do cultural mediation. Okay, so we need to make, coach travel, bus travel more desirable, more appealing, and there are ways to do that. And so I think, people would be happy to take advantage of that time. There can be podcasts, there can be playlists. You're going through beautiful scenery, of course, in Normandy. And so I think it'll put people in an atmosphere of a festival as well. And here's something about the site that you're headed to so that you're really prepared for your visit as well. So I think that green mobility, if we take advantage of that extra time that's necessary, we can optimize it, and that would make it more appealing. And so for you, Heather, could you come back to some of the solutions? Tell us, so what have you done at Blenheim Palace, and what are you working on? And in particular, you have a partnership with Good Journey?
Yes, we do, Margot. So Good Journey are a web-based company who will map journeys from wherever you're going to your tourist attraction, and they will give you the most sustainable route and tell you the carbon output of your journey. And then if you use that journey and book through them, you get 50% off your entry price into that establishment, which actually is, you know, a lot of places are very expensive now, so it makes a big difference. So at Blenheim Palace, we have committed to be carbon neutral by 2027 and to have 50% of our audience arrive by sustainable travel. So at least 22% or nearly 30% of our audience on a good year, so going back to 2019, were from overseas. So when we measured our carbon outputs, and you think that amount of those many people coming from overseas, that's a lot of carbon in our scope 3 that we had to offset. So we're working really, really hard with companies such as Good Journey, but also we're working with our local travel networks, with our inbound tour operators, and also with the bus companies and etc. And we're trying to liaise and do packages and work with them to create a similar sort of experience. We will give anybody arriving by sustainable travel to Blenheim Palace, we will give you today a 30% discount. You've just got to prove you arrived that way. So that's by bus, by bike, by electric car. We are working with, as I say, our group, our trade partners. So any bus companies that are bringing groups of people to come, we'll promote that company. We'll suggest people use that bus to come. And also you get a big discount off your ticket price. So we started working on this a couple of years ago, and we've really ramped up the efforts. And we now, I think at the beginning of this year, it was 1 in 8 people were coming by sustainable transport. And in November, it's 1 in 6. So we've got a lot of work to go to get 1 in 2 coming that way, but we're on that journey. The other thing that we can do is educate our visitors. So we have an electric car event, which we publicise. So we're trying to encourage all our communities to turn to electric. Not easy when there's not the grid capacity for those electric charging points. But we're working on a solar venture. We have land, so we can, create solar power if we get the permission to do it. But then we've got to work with our local energy companies for grid capacity. So it's a huge minefield. But at the moment, we've taken a lot of steps towards educating and incentivising our visitors to come in a sustainable way.
Well, yes, educating visitors and incentives, that's a very interesting and no doubt effective tool. Emmanuel, could you tell us a bit about some of the projects that the Paris region is working on? And you're probably doing some similar things to what Heather just mentioned. Well, it's true that there we have different ways of taking action. First of all, there is support that can be provided to cultural institutions to make access by bicycle easier, for example, and also to allow them to experiment with on-demand transport. For example, for people with disabilities. But don't forget that our residents, local residents, are the bulk of our visitors, except for places like Versailles Palace, of course. But we really mustn't forget that it's people living in the region that represent the bulk of our visitors. And so there are reductions on admission if you have the public transport pass, for example, the Navigo pass in Paris. Okay, let's see here in the room. Who in the room knew that you can have access to cultural institutions? Okay, well, you're cultural professionals. Okay, so yes, you know this, but I myself didn't know that my transit pass gives me reduced admission to cultural sites. Well, yes, that's important. People need to know this. So if you and we communicate about this. So that's one type of tool that we believe works well, because price, we know, is a factor in people's decision for certain types of cultural tourism. And in particularly, in times of inflation, people are paying more attention. And so if they can get a reduced price on admission, and the fact that their transit pass allows them to get to the site more easily. Okay, this is going to take time, okay, and we haven't communicated enough. We need to do more, and we need to have the partnership with more cultural sites as well. But we're quite convinced that this will work. Coming back to Caroline. So tell us, why today is the notion of green mobility becoming so much more important for cultural venues, be they public or private, whereas, well, I think 10 years ago we weren't thinking about it so much. Well, 10 years ago the climate issues were not top of mind. In fact, there wasn't much communication about it. Most people, I must say, including myself, people weren't sufficiently aware, so we weren't asking ourselves the hard questions about how to get to more remote locations. Whereas now, in the past 2 or 3 years, we get much more information on the topic. There's, after with COVID and very hot summers and extreme weather events and the forest fires in France, the IPCC report as well, ringing all of the alarm bells, is finally being heard. And so it's true that we know that, mobility, we all know, contributes to pollution and emissions. But I'd say, people were lacking information on the topic. Sometimes if you don't understand why you're being asked to do, sort your waste or save water, well, you're less inclined to do it. So you have to explain to people why you need to do this. Sorry, I'm glancing at my notes. And we have been working a lot on slow tourism, and it's been a real hot marketing buzzword as well, slow tourism. So spending 2 hours in a train instead of 1 hour in a car. I mean, this isn't a problem to people who have decided to adopt this mode of tourism. So it will take more time, and we just need to think differently about that travel time. For some people, the travel time is part of the holiday. In fact, it's traveling differently and enjoying the scenery, for example. And I really like the ideal, Emmanuel, that we heard from Philippe about taking advantage of that time to communicate with people. So I think that's a very interesting ideal. And so we also have a Green Mobility Commission. We are in discussions with the French National Rail, SNCF, to discuss as well about offers for tourists in trains, and not just focus on commuters and locals. But there's also the question of managing tourist flows as well. We know some sites are overrun in Paris, whereas a lot of regions around Paris have the opposite problem, not enough visitors. So we need to be able to make it easier to have better offerings, better packages, better proposals to get tourists to go elsewhere. And so I believe that people are going to be starting to look at these alternative types of offers. I think tourists will be starting to look for different ways to be a tourist as well, and to have a different type of experience. So I think it could be good for everyone involved, for the more remote territories and for visitors. Well, talking about tourist flows, Emmanuel said something I noticed. We welcome the world here in Paris, but now the challenge is how do we do this in the best way possible? Well, yes, for the Paris region, it's one of 50 million visitors a year to Paris and the area. So we can't say that we don't want to have tourists from all over the world anymore, and they're going to get. It wouldn't even matter if we said we didn't want them; they would continue to come anyway. It's not as if we can control that. And while China was completely closed off, the rest of the world has definitely been coming back to Paris. So what we have to do is to ensure that, first of all, the French and Europeans can get around in more sustainable modes. But because we are a #1 world destination for tourists, we have to set the example, in fact. And so we need to be doing more. We need to be a model for others. And I think we also have to innovate, which means experimenting, test things. They might work, they might not work, but because we have these flows, I think it does mean that a lot of solutions would be workable here. Philippe, you were talking about your festival. Your idea is to have exhibits out in forests, so not just in a museum or even a cultural venue. So, if you have coaches come in with hundreds of tourists, well, is there an inconsistency there? And trying to get a massive numbers coming to your festival. Well, yes, we have asked ourselves this question. In the most recent event, we did nighttime events in August. So it was just a quick event over the weekends, and we wanted to create an unexpected experience at unusual times. People aren't used to going at nightfall. But we did a concert out in the forest, and we worked with the National Forest Agency. You can't just walk into a forest with all of your stage lighting and things like that. And so the National Forest Agency were, watching us carefully, but, working hand in hand with them. But we wanted to ensure that we would limit the, equipment we would have to bring in. And so we worked with that agency. Now, in terms of mobility, we were talking about, yes, well, then there's the question of who's going to pay for this, who's going to support this, how do we get people to the forest? Okay, now, it's not the forest isn't very distant from the city of Rouen, but nonetheless, you have to get out there. So what we did was we organized shuttle buses. And so the city of Rouen agreed to take on this responsibility, but in fact, the invoice came to us. I mean, they organized it with some transport companies, but they didn't pay for it in the end. Because it's beyond the scope of, the city government. But, okay, so that was a 3-day weekend. But if it's a 5-month festival, we can't pay for shuttles every day. I mean, because, 300 shuttles, it's the cost of the entire festival, in fact. So we certainly can't, so it's about trying to, allocate the funding that you have. So when you mentioned of, trying to be consistent, and a lot of our festival is focused on outdoor things. You know, the subjects of the Impressionist paintings, in fact, a lot of it was outdoor. So I think it's an important time to, you know, talk about not only the Industrial Revolution of the time, but now the digital revolution. And so we do have to be careful in how we go about things. All right, then. Well, let me turn to Heather. So how can green mobility help us now to control flows, perhaps? You know, there's over-tourism at some sites, of course, and at the same time foster a local economy. Because when you're working on green mobility, there's the transport question, and you are making access easier to certain sites in regions. Well, but, you know, some areas, people always turn to cars. But what are some of the other options?
So Blenheim Palace is, as I said, in a rural area with only small. There is a major road network coming close to us, but then as you get closer, the roads get smaller and smaller. So in 2019, when we had nearly 1 million visitors, we were not liked by our local communities at all because of the pollution, the traffic, and when we had events, and we major on large events at certain times of the year, we brought the communities to a standstill. So we were already getting a lot of backlash about over-tourism. So one of our focuses is to drive staycation, overnight stays in the local economy. So people stay for 2 nights, 3 nights, eat in the local restaurants, shop in the local shops, drive the artisan souvenirs, etc. So we've already started on that route, and we are encouraging other similar larger tourist attractions to do the same, and then coach networks to move from one to the other. So in fact, not only are we driving into the individual traveller, but also into the group travel as well. It was already there to some extent in the group travel, but we're pushing and working harder with our partners to make this happen. So the other thing that we're doing, because we're a business, and we're putting a network of sensors around the estate, measuring our pollution now. So we know that we are driving a reduction in the pollution by promoting sustainable transport and by encouraging people to stay locally and not travel in between tourist attractions as much as they used to in the past. So again, early stages, but there's lots of stuff that you can do to improve your local communities, and again, sharing best practice with those large tourist attractions that are in denial, actually, that they have anything to do with overseas travellers or anything that happens beyond their walls. We don't agree with that, and we're really pushing hard to share and educate our other equal large tourist attractions, and not just the Blenheim Palace.
And so, well, we just have a few minutes left to our round table, so perhaps a tough question to wrap up. So, Caroline, I don't know if you want to answer, but perhaps someone else might want to answer. Is there a real need now to improve the ties between the public authorities in charge of transport in particular and cultural venues? You know, as Philippe has said, well, you know, the city of Rouen couldn't pay for coaches out into the forest. It's beyond their scope. So is there a way to achieve some sort of collaboration? What can be done to strengthen that relationship? Emmanuel? Well, let me talk about an experiment that we ran with the National Rail Company, and I think we have begun to achieve some interesting things. So the rail network is communicating more in stations, even in the trains, about the local cultural offering. And in fact, so it's for locals. It's true. You know, they would like their trains to be full on the weekends, so they do have an economic incentive to get more people in their trains in the weekend. So I think there's a real change in attitude there, but it takes time. Of course, you know, it can take 10 years to get this really into people's way of thinking. People tend to think, oh, it's too long, it's going to take too long, I'd rather take the car. It will take time. But we've developed a good cooperation with the train company. It's taking too much time, I think, given the environmental challenges, but it's a step in the right direction. We talked about bicycles on board the trains. Well, it's true. A lot of our trains are 30 years old, and nobody was thinking about ensuring that the trains would be easier for bicycle riders. But little by little, as we change fleets of trains, well, they are better adapted. Well, as you've said, so we're running out of time facing the environmental challenges.
Yes, thank you. Just a couple of things that I wanted to add. I think it's excellent that we are discussing greener mobility. I did not talk about greenhouse gases emissions in the tourism sector more broadly, but the 2021 study showed that 77% of our greenhouse gases come from mobility, mostly from flying tourists in, but 6% comes from local transportation. So you see that we do have some options to try and work on reducing our emissions, but we do need to have a mix of clients and visitors, with local visitors and foreign visitors. Another thing that I wanted to react on, I always say that we need to better articulate tourism and culture. Those two sectors need to interface better. And I think that many cultural institutions have excellent skills in mediation. And we should be able to use them to better raise awareness among tourists. I think that raising awareness among tourists, that's an issue for us, and I know that in cultural sector, they're excellent when it comes to communicating with the audience and raising awareness. So I think that we could or should be able to use their skills. For cultural institutions who want to be better or to get better on that chapter, I think it's important to keep in mind that we do not only support tourism institutions in getting better, but also cultural institutions, so they should feel free to get in touch with us. We'll be happy to help them. Thank you to the four of you. Thank you, Caroline, for being with us, even though you were not actually prepared for this roundtable. Do we have questions among the audience? Thank you. Good morning. My question goes to Heather.
You mentioned the offsetting process you are setting up in terms of carbon. Could you detail a bit more about that?
The question was actually asked in English. She asked about your offsetting mechanism. Did you hear that? She asked about for more detail about the offsetting mechanism.
Okay, we are set in 2,000 acres. We have a large tree planting program going. So if a visitor wants to offset their journey in our ticketing function, you can choose to work out the carbon footprint of your journey. And then you have the chance to offset that by, at the moment, it's by paying £5 towards a tree planting program. What we want to do is be able to work out actually what it means in trees. So if you're offsetting from China to come to Blenheim, what that would mean. But we haven't got the technicality to do that so far. But at the moment, we have I think we had over December time, we had over 2,000 people offsetting their journeys by planting a tree, and then we will plant those trees in the north of the park, creating new woodlands for the local communities with pathways and forest schools, etc., for local schools. So not only is it offsetting the carbon, it's also enhancing the community as well. And we will continue with that programme, and we're looking at other ways of offsetting carbon by more biodiversity, but at the moment there's no accredited scheme for doing that. So we're waiting for accredited schemes to come forward so we can look at giving choices, whether it's tree planting or hedge planting or other ways of doing it. But we're early in the game, but we're finding a lot of people are engaging, which is really promising.
We have a couple of minutes left. Do we have any other questions? Thank you. My question is about how to encourage greener mobility. I am really wondering about that. Cultural actors and tourism actors, do you think they could market commercial offers that would better encourage those kind of practices? Or maybe more on the punishing side, maybe if you pay more if you're sitting alone in your car and pay less if you are driving with more passengers, if you're sharing your car. Would that be a way of acting upon this climate emergency? Are there any options when it comes to admission fees that we can use to improve that? Also, I would like to add that sustainable development and green mobility in culture, I think it's been quite some time that we've been looking at the issue. The 2021 Agenda for Culture, for example, was set up in 2004, so we can't really say that the question has been only discussed for 2 to 3 years. It's a lot older than that. That's a topic that has been discussed, but I think it's different whether you're talking about incentives or punishment. Mostly schemes are set up around incentives and not, punishing mechanisms. I did not want to use that word of punishment. It's a tragic word, but it's been bandied about in a number of symposiums on greener development. And really, the question I'm asking is, as players in the sector, should we not just stop thinking about only in terms of incentives and actually go to punishment to try and ban bad practices? Thank you for your question. First, I'll react to the previous comment that you made. It's true that the Meadows report dates back to 1972. So yes, true, there has been work before the previous years, but I was really thinking in terms of awareness. Okay, punishment now. That's a taboo. That's a real taboo. And I'm not in favor of a punitive ecology. Now, of course, I'm only speaking for myself. When I say that, I think we will need at some point to have punishment, but they will not necessarily the right actors for that. There are some hotels that will offer discounts depending on where you are, on if you are trying to lower your energy consumption in the room. So that's on the incentive side. On the punishment side now, I think there will be punitive regulations and laws. In the diesel sector, for example, there's a carbon tax already, so you have some punitive actions that are in place or could be in place. But if you want it to be accepted among the general population, you can't frame it like that. So either it's a regulation for everyone, or you can't do it. It can't be a single economic actor who says, I'm going to punish you for what you do. Because if someone does that in an isolated fashion, they're just going to lose clients. And that's it. So that's true for anyone in the cultural or tourism sectors. I think we need to focus on awareness raising. I think that's our role, and that punishment is not our role. But punishment will be there from the legal side. We, on our side, we need to anticipate the rules and regulations that are going to come from the government. We need to adapt because they're going to come. But we're not there to punish clients by ourselves. One last question. Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion and for your talks. Just like my colleague just did, I am going to use a taboo word that I haven't heard today, and it's the word of degrowth. Some festivals, like the Panorama Festival in Morlaix, decided to reduce its size by 50%. So they decided to halve the number of visitors that they have to be more in line with those issues of green development. And I think that indeed we can't be always trying to do everything bigger and bigger and bigger, where people will fly in for just a couple of days to just look at a single exhibition. And I'm really wondering if maybe the tourism sector should be starting to discuss degrowth. I don't think that it's necessarily going to be a bummer on the actual experience. Because for now, if you go to the Louvre, for example, you can't really look at the piece that you came to see. There are so many people you can't even see it. I'd like to take that question, if you don't mind, because indeed that's a question that we really discussed when we organized the Nuit Normande Impressionists Painting Night Festival. We really organized that much more locally than in the past. So all the events that we created were designed with local theatre companies. We thought about mobility, local mobility, and there was a concert in the middle of the woods, in the little woods. And we did that with a partner, Le Sensis, and they are in the habit of having a huge festival in the spring with huge stages, a lot of visitors. And we designed this concert in the woods together with them, and it was such a success that they actually decided to downsize their spring festival, which is called Rush. And they decided to instead have smaller events, local events, instead of having, you know, this oversized show that they used to have. So this local event, local concert that we had, inspired a change in a bigger event. So yes, I do think that big players in the field are starting to look at that possibility. And you were just talking about big museums, and you know, there are big exhibitions in Orsay, the Orsay Museum, in the Louvre Museum, etc. And there as well, we're also rethinking exhibitions by thinking how works of art can be loaned more locally. Yes, I'd like to pick up on that. I think we need to be careful because we have a general economic model that is centered on finding your own resources. Because we don't have subsidies, because we don't have enough support from local councils or government, etc. So we need to find our own money for whatever we want to do. So we need to be careful with that. I do agree that we need to think about degrowth and downsizing events, but it's going to take some time and it's not that easy. Maybe you can do that with a festival that already has some funding that comes from different channels. So if they want to downsize, it's going to work. A museum with permanent staff it's going to be more difficult for them because they still need to find the money somewhere. And for our kind of events and sites, we've seen that during the COVID crisis, thousands of hotels and restaurants and sites have been hit very hard by the crisis. And of course, they had to rethink their model, but that's just words. It's extremely complex. It's easy to say, it's difficult to do. And it means that you have to change everything if you're going to do that. And a reality is that a Chinese tourist is going to spend a lot more money locally than a local tourist. And local actors need that money. And I'm not just talking about hotels, even big museums, they need those Chinese tourists. They bring it a lot more money than local tourists. So it takes a lot of time. It takes years if you want to change the model entirely. Thank you. Can I just react very quickly? I know that we got to the end of our allotted time. Yes, but very briefly on degrowth. Indeed, it's still a bad word. You can talk about reducing your impacts, but using that word of degrowth, well, that's dangerous. I was talking about Les Calanques. In the south, there was a seaside town that really decided to downsize and lower the number of tourists that were there. And in that seaside resort, they decided to halve the number of visitors. And indeed, the experience was so much more enjoyable for everyone. Thank you to the four of you. And thank you to our audience, and we will be wrapping up. Thank you.